It's a great American value to protest, but I don't believe living in a pup tent for Hamas is really helpful.
When you make those charges, that is not anti-Semitic. That is a reality.
They do not have the right to set up tent cities on our public spaces and turn our cities into garbage dumps.
95% of the young people who are on these campuses are there because they believe there's a fundamental injustice being perpetrated.
Pro-Palestine protests continue to roil college campuses nationwide, and lawmakers are getting involved in the conversation. More on that in a moment, but first, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Saudi Arabia calling for a ceasefire and the release of all hostages held by Hamas. It comes one day after President Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And Congress returns to session. Lawmakers are back in Washington this week against the backdrop of those college campus protests and bitter Republican infighting in the House, which is putting Speaker Mike Johnson's job in jeopardy. Here to discuss all that and more is Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill. Julia, my friend, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michael.
Now, as I mentioned at the top, Congress is back this week, the House today, the Senate tomorrow. There isn't much on the must-pass to-do list, so politics and drama is set to take center stage, which there is plenty to go around. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, still threatening to force a vote on Speaker Johnson's ouster, but a number of hardline Republicans are now steering clear from that effort. They say they don't want to cause all this chaos so close to the election. Now, Julia, you've been covering the lead up to November closely, both the presidential and those down-ballot races. Is this a smart move by the hardliners to try to avoid the speaker chaos so close to November? And would that chaos really affect results come November?
I do think it's a smart move, Michael. Right now, these hardline Republicans are realizing and seeing that they have a very, very slim majority in the House of Representatives. And quite frankly, in November, they're going to face a very uphill climb to stay in the majority. We see that Democrats do appear to be very optimistic about their chances of taking back the majority in the House. So right now, I think Republicans want to focus on maybe being unified and backing their incumbents in some of these swing districts or these challenging districts. You know, I think there is the risk that if they were to go through this speaker chaos again, it would be easy for Democrats to point and say, look, you could have a lawmaker, like me, who's going to pass legislation, talk about and, legislate on issues that are important to the American people, or you can have more of the inside baseball happening within the Republican conference. So I think that's the thinking you're seeing from these hardliners. They don't want a round two of Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, a lot of potential for different avenues of messaging based on how things pan out in the coming weeks. Julia, one must-pass item on the docket, and there aren't many, but one of them is reauthorization of the FAA. Congress staring down a May 10th deadline to do that. House and Senate negotiators released their deal for that FAA reauthorization bill early this morning. What exactly is in it?
Yeah, so I haven't gotten a chance to take a good look at the bill, but essentially we're going to see, with this federal airline authorization, more, probably scrutiny over airlines and, these airline manufacturers. We know that obviously Boeing has faced a lot of scrutiny for the makeup of its planes and certainly for some instances that have happened in the air. So there's a lot of public pressure and also pressure from lawmakers for the Federal Aviation Commission and also for these airlines and airline manufacturers to really start to get it together when it comes to airline safety and for air travel in this country. We're coming back from the pandemic. We're fully back in many ways from the pandemic. So we're seeing travel really at full capacity once again. So you're seeing that push once again, for more accountability for this industry.
Yeah, let's shift back now to one of our top stories, those pro-Palestine protests that are continuing to roil college campuses across the country. There were more than 200 arrests on university grounds on Saturday. That, according to the New York Times. Congressional lawmakers have stepped in to criticize, or in some cases, stand with those protesters. We're seeing the latest example of that this morning. A group of House Democrats wrote a letter to Columbia's Board of Trustees. Julia, what exactly are they asking for?
Well, they're asking for these trustees to either resign or take down the encampment. So it's putting the trustees in, obviously a tough situation because they feel obviously that the encampment is obviously bringing a lot of negative attention to the school. The response to the encampment, whether it's from the university or the security, from police, is certainly bringing a lot of negative attention. But look, they also want to make it clear that they're standing up to the students, that the students aren't ruling a private university like Columbia. So they're in a tough situation as to how to move forward, and they're coming under bipartisan pressure from Republicans and Democrats. That being said, though, we're seeing this once again shine a light on the divide between Democrats on the Israel-Hamas war and how to respond to these protests. You have some Democrats, like the 21 that signed this letter earlier, saying resign or get rid of the encampment, while you have more progressive Democrats like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Senator Bernie Sanders saying that these students are just drawing attention to what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation to say the least. Let's stick on this topic of the Israel-Hamas war, but through the international lens. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East meeting with leaders today. He spoke earlier with World Economic Forum president in Saudi Arabia, where he called for a ceasefire and the release of those hostages. Take a listen.
We've said clearly and for some time now on Rafah that in the absence of a plan to ensure that civilians will not be harmed, we can't support a major military operation in Rafah. The quickest way to bring this to an end is to get to a ceasefire and the release of hostages.
President Biden also spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the weekend. Julia, what did they talk about, those two leaders, and how close are negotiators to this ceasefire, which several individuals have been pushing for months?
Look, I think you've seen President Biden put more pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu as we can continue to see, the humanitarian devastation that's happening in Gaza. So I think there's a push to, reach a ceasefire. But as you heard Secretary Blinken say in that clip, this is very conditional in many ways on the release of the Israeli hostages, as well as the Israeli hostages' bodies who did not survive. So they're really pushing for that. But it's unclear whether Hamas is going to come to the table on the release of those hostages. A week ago, Hamas was releasing video footage of a number of Israeli hostages, or a few of them, including Hirsch Goldberg, an Israeli American who's being held in Gaza still. So, that's adding additional pressure, I think, from the United States on Hamas. Now, we don't know what Hamas is going to do. The way Blinken and the State Department is framing this is that they're saying that this is conditional on them coming to the table. But at the same time, there's no question that Israel is under a ton of international scrutiny, including from major world bodies like the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, to cease the targeting in Gaza and the airstrikes in Gaza. So it's unclear what's going to happen, but pressure being inflicted on both sides.
Yeah, that's for sure. A lot of pressure in this situation right now. There was some news over the weekend. World Central Kitchen announced on Sunday that it is resuming operations in Gaza nearly 1 month after 7 of the group's aid workers were killed in a drone strike. The organization said it has 276 trucks, which is equal to almost 8 million meals, ready to enter the Gaza Strip. Julia, talk about the significance of this development, especially as lawmakers continue to raise concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Well, we know that the World Central Kitchen, not only in Gaza, but in many war zones and places in need throughout the world, has played a pivotal role of feeding innocent civilians. So I think this is much needed aid to Gazans who are, quite frankly, starving right now. We're facing the prospect of starvation. It's going to be interesting, though, because Israel is under a lot of pressure to avoid, striking at humanitarian aid workers. That was a very, largely condemned move on their part. So I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on Israel as to how they move forward on this. But I thought it was notable. Last week, there was a memorial service at the National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C., where the World Central Kitchen head chef Jose Andreas was talking about this. And, I think this organization in general and the strike on those workers nearly a month ago really was able to shine a further light on what's happening in Gaza, inflict more pressure on Israel, because you have someone like Jose Andreas, who is obviously a well-known celebrity chef, but he's very, very well connected here in Washington.
All right, Julia, campaign trail time. Washington Post reported over the weekend that former President Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis had a private meeting in Miami on Sunday. I mean, when DeSantis dropped out of the race, those two were down each other's throats at odds. I know that you spent a lot of time covering DeSantis. So what are the two reported to have discussed, and what is the strategy here?
Yeah, so this meeting took place over breakfast while Governor DeSantis was down in Miami, and apparently they were brought together by a third party, a contact of the two. And look, I think this is essentially the strategy of unifying the party right now. President Trump knows that Ron DeSantis, whether he likes him or not, is a popular governor. He's a popular Republican governor of Florida, and that Florida's shift to the right is in many part thanks to Ron DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis knows that for his own political future and also for the future of the party in November, there probably needs to be an olive branch extended to Donald Trump. Now, reports say the meeting was cordial, that it was productive, with DeSantis saying he would fundraise for Trump. So, I don't know if necessarily DeSantis is going to be on the short list for vice president, but I think this shows that DeSantis is going to play a major role or a significant role in Republican campaigning for Republicans up and down the ballot.
Yeah, it begs the question also, is Nikki Haley next? Which I think that one's less likely than Ron DeSantis, but we'll have to keep an eye. One more question for you, Julia. Let's take one more trip up to Capitol Hill. There was a bit of a contentious interview yesterday between Fox News anchor Maria Bartiromo and House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan about the lack of progress in the House Republican investigations that are focused on President Biden. Let's zero in on the impeachment investigation specifically. It seems like that probe has kind of hit a dead end. Hunter Biden came in, testified behind closed doors. We haven't really seen too much after that.
We haven't. And I think Maria Bartiromo was asking what a lot of us have asked with these investigations as to, what's really the end goal here, because they really have seemed to hit a dead end. And I think a lot of critics called these investigations essentially political theater on the part of House Republicans, and especially when you're seeing, the top priorities for voters being on the economy, crime, the situation at the southern border. I think there is a concern that focusing on the impeachment, which is so inside baseball and very partisan, something that I think Americans are quite frankly sick of, having gone through the impeachment of a Homeland Security Secretary recently, and of course the two-time impeachment of former President Trump. They want to be focused on those issues that are more, pertain more to the American people on their day-to-day basis. So we'll see what House Republicans continue to do with these investigations. But I think it's notable that Maria Bartiromo was saying that to Jim Jordan.
Yeah, a lot of important decisions Republicans have to make in the coming weeks and months. Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Michael.
Russia warned this weekend of a, quote, harsh response if Western countries seized its already frozen assets. That warning coming from a Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson on Sunday. And it comes after reporting from the Wall Street Journal said some Western allies are considering using Russia's frozen assets as leverage to regain areas of Ukraine currently held by Russia. About $300 billion of Russian assets were frozen by the U.S. and its allies at the beginning of the war. The new foreign aid package President Biden just recently signed into law gave the okay to take the frozen assets here in the U.S. and use them to benefit Ukraine. But it's unlikely to happen without agreement from other ally nations. Shifting gears now, a proposal for lawmakers and judges facing credible threats of violence to receive special security escorts at airports, backed by Senator Ted Cruz, has been blocked. The provision was kept out of the Federal Aviation Administration's reauthorization bill because of an objection from Mississippi Representative Benny Thompson, who is the top Democrat on the Homeland Security Committee. Cruz had hoped to give lawmakers and judges facing threats the same treatment as senior administration officials who go through special security screenings. But a source familiar with the negotiation said Representative Thompson blocked the language from being added to the FAA reauthorization bill after the TSA lobbied against it. Staying up here on Capitol Hill, FIFA President Gianni Infantino is heading to Washington to visit Capitol Hill this week to discuss plans for the 2026 World Cup. Infantino will meet with leaders of the Congressional Soccer Caucus to dive into preparations for the upcoming World Cup, which will be played in 16 cities across the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And while on the Hill, lawmakers are expected to lobby the FIFA president on the United States' bid to host the 2027 World Cup. That's all for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Mychael Schnell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.